Dr. Gillian Brown from the University of St Andrews. Gillian's actually on sabbatical just now in Cambridge, and so it's come all the way up from the south of England, and it has basically no way of getting back down again. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks, Emma.
Okay, you're welcome. Great. Well, I actually don't mind being stuck in Scotland for a while. It's nice to be back. This is St Andrews, where I'm from, which is about just up the coast here, about 50 miles away. It's much better than Edinburgh. It's very small though. So this is about it. This is North Street and this is South Street. That's about it. That's how small it is.
Market Street.
Yeah, there's a little Market Street here. Yeah, true. It's got an old castle. It has a cathedral. Lots of history. It's an old medieval town. So it's very pretty. So if you want a little excursion, it's about an hour on the train when the train's running up the coast. Great. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this workshop. I'm going to talk about evolution and sex differences in behaviour, which is my main interest. And I'm not a linguist, so I've enjoyed hearing research from other disciplines and perspectives over the past couple of days. My background is from animal behaviour. I studied zoology in Cambridge as an undergraduate and a PhD student. And I was particularly interested in early sex differences in behaviour. I studied rhesus macaques and other primates. I was particularly interested in infant through to adolescent sex differences. And as an independent researcher, I've continued that interest in St Andrews, looking at rodents. And I'm interested in how early exposure to hormones produced by the testes and the ovaries can influence the development of sex differences in behaviour. So that's sort of part of my experimental work, is animal behaviour and early development. This is just a little graph to show you. These are testosterone levels in the rhesus macaque and in a rat, which shows very similar profiles across time of exposure to testosterone levels. So the kind of questions I'm interested in is what role do those circulating hormones have in development of behaviour? I've also looked at topics such as sex differences in investment, so how much do primate mothers invest in sons versus daughters? And related to that, what number of male and female offspring do they have? So what's the birth-sex ratio in primates? I've also looked at sexual selection and how that can impact on our understanding of traits in primates and other species. For example, looking at the sexual swellings that are shown in around 30 species of primates. So we've used comparative and meta-analytic techniques to investigate those traits. And I've also worked with other primates, for example, looking at cooperation, food sharing with infants, whether that impacts on whether they learn about diet, what to eat and how to forage. So I have a broad range of interests in behavioural development from a zoology perspective, but today I'm going to talk about my research on human behaviour. This is a picture very similar to my daughter when she was this age. She had these little curls, but this isn't my daughter, but it does remind me of her at a very early age. So how can we use evolutionary theory to think about sex differences in human behaviour and also behaviour in cognition in humans more generally? And it's interesting how debates about sex differences in behaviour often have dichotomies, and we've actually heard quite a lot of discussion about dichotomies during this workshop. For example, nature versus nurture is one that we could use in reference to how people have talked about sex differences. People talk about biology versus culture, and sometimes I have a real problem with how people use the word biology and align it against this idea of culture. Similar to the nature and nurture. Evolutionary explanations of behaviour versus social, psychological explanations of behaviour is a similar dichotomy. And even the term sex and gender kind of follows the same line. So when you talk about a sex difference, it kind of implies maybe that you have some notion of how that behaviour develops versus something that you call a gender difference. Already by using that term implies that you think something different is going on in terms of what the processes underlying that sex difference are. So what I try to do in my research is to try and produce a more integrated evolutionary approach to the study of sex differences that really tries to get away from this dichotomous idea and really try and look at how variables can be incorporated in how we think about behaviour. So if we just did a little schematic of sort of a typical nature versus nurture view of behaviour, we've got genes and we've got hormones, sort of on the nature or the biology side of it. And then we've got cultural factors or early socialisation factors, which are maybe on the nurture side of this dichotomy. And I could equally swap that and put perhaps innate versus learned, or sex versus gender in the centre of this diagram here. Okay, so what I'm trying to get away from is exactly this kind of picture, and to produce something that looks more like this. It's much more complicated, but looks at how multiple factors impact on the behaviour of individuals. Evolutionary theory, to me, still forms the core of this. Okay, so my background is in zoology and evolutionary biology, and I'm on the side of saying that actually evolutionary theory can provide a framework by which to ask questions about sex differences. But right at the end of this talk, I want to come back to what I mean by evolutionary theory in the centre of this diagram. My work on human behaviour has taken various forms. So with colleagues, for example, Kevin Leyland, who also works at St Andrews, but there are others such as Johan Bolhuis in the Netherlands, Monique Borghoff-Mulder, who's an anthropologist in the US. We've written various papers that have tried to address the question of how could you take a more integrated view of evolution and human behaviour. Kevin and I have co-authored a book called Sense and Nonsense, Evolutionary Perspectives on Human Behaviour. The first edition was in 2002, and the second edition was published in 2011 by Oxford University Press. It goes through all the various approaches to how evolutionary theory is being used. So we start with a history chapter looking at from Darwin through to current times of how people have thought about evolution and human behaviour and cognition. Then we review each of the subfields that have emerged. Firstly, human sociobiology, which was prevalent in the 1960s through 70s. And then we look at the more modern fields such as human behavioural ecology, evolutionary psychology with a capital E and capital P, cultural evolution, and gene culture coevolution. I'll come back to some of these terms a little bit more later in the chapter, later in the talk. And then the final chapter tries to bring together these perspectives and say, are they really disagreeing with each other? Are they complementary? Are they contradictory in some way? And trying to point out where the distinctions are. So if you want sort of a background to where I'm coming from, where this field of evolution and human behaviour is having its discussions, then that might be a good starting point. A lot of people use this in the UK and the US and Australia for teaching courses as well at undergraduate and sort of master's level. So what I want to do before I move on, though, is in this edited volume that we did of the Philtrans B in 2011, we had an edited themed issue on evolution and human behavioural diversity, where we really tried to argue that if you're taking an evolutionary perspective, you really need to incorporate the idea that humans show a lot of variation in behaviour within and across populations. So any evolutionary account must incorporate that variation. That was the theme of that topic. One of the chapters was written by Pat Bateson and Matteo Mamelli. And Pat Bateson was one of my lecturers in zoology at Cambridge, so I've known Pat since I was a wee undergraduate. And they look at this term innate or instinctive. Okay? And Pat's been talking about this for decades now. The terms innate and instinctive, if you're trained in animal behaviour, are highly problematic, partly because the terms are used with multiple meanings. And we've seen this already in this workshop so far. I've been quite interested in how people have been using the term innate. So one of the meanings could be influenced by genes, that's been mentioned. Another could be not learnt. It's not to do with what the environment around you is. It's something that's not learnt. It's something that's universal or species typical. We've heard that as well. Or it's perhaps something that's present in birth, present at early life, at some early stage. Okay? So people use the term innate in multiple ways, and Pat spent a lot of time discussing why might this be problematic. And one of the reasons is if you use the term innate, we don't know which one of these you're necessarily referring to, And also it could be that if you use it in one way, then your listener might think you're actually then, by inference, implying all of these other factors. And if you actually look at how animals develop, these aren't all exactly the same. So you might think that something's influenced by genes. It might not be universal. You might think it's not present at birth, but it isn't unlearned. So it's much clearer, Pat argues, to actually say what you mean rather than relying on the term innate. So for people in animal behaviour literature or the evolution in human behaviour field that I'm familiar with, don't use the term innate at all. I haven't done for several decades, and don't talk about instinctive behaviour either. But obviously that varies according to other disciplines, which I find quite interesting. The Mameli and Bateson chapter in the Phil Trans is one place where they expand on this idea, if you're interested in looking. There's an earlier paper by Bateson and Mameli in developmental psychobiology, which gives a slightly stronger statement, but really sums up what Pat's trying to say. So Bateson and Mameli argue that these definitions of innate are unsatisfactory because they're based on simplistic and empirically outmoded views of development. And I would suggest that if you're interested in that debate from an animal behaviour background, then Pat's writings are very accessible in critiquing the term innate. So what I'm going to do in this rest of this talk is just give you a couple of examples of the kind of research that I'm doing to try and take this integrated perspective and think about this idea of how can we get away from thinking of something that's nature versus nurture or innate versus, any of those dichotomous terms. What kind of things, what kind of data could we draw? And I'm going to first show you a meta-analysis of sex differences and sensation seeking to show you how people can take the same kind of data and interpret it in two different ways. And I'm going to finish off with a more recent study that we've done on sex differences in confidence and use of social information. So a lot of the questions about sex differences are framed within evolutionary biology, but also evolutionary psychology, based on this idea that there's this difference in the variance of reproductive success of males and females. So you've got two seals here who are males and they're fighting it out. One might do really well in terms of competing against all of the other males and get lots of matings and have high reproductive success, whereas some is going to be rubbish and maybe not pass on their genes to any offspring, whereas perhaps females have a much lower variance in how successful they are in reproduction. Okay, so it's this difference in the variance. So males, highly variable in terms of reproductive success, females much less variable. That's kind of formed a cornerstone of thinking about sex differences from the 1970s with Trivers' work, really. Okay, so this is a kind of general idea that kind of makes sense. And from that, evolutionary theory has gone on to predict that this kind of explains why males compete intensely for mating opportunities and are willing to take risks, to fight and to sort of risk it all to gain matings, while females are more expected to be choosy in terms of their mating and more cautious than males. So again, standard evolutionary theory has contributed to our understanding of sex differences in animals, and this is just giving you a very broad summary of how some of the ideas work. Now, evolutionary psychologists have kind of taken these standard evolutionary theory ideas and applied them to human behaviour. And here's just a few examples of books that have been published that kind of use this perspective. So we have Geoffrey Miller, and we were chatting last night about Geoffrey Miller's work. We have David Buss, who's a very well-known American evolutionary psychologist. Jared Diamond was even getting in on the act on thinking about sex differences in human mating and mate preferences, waist-to-hip ratio and facial preferences, for example. And a lot of these derive directly from that very generic description of what sexual selection theory might tell us. So evolutionary psychologists with a capital E, capital P, describe the brain as containing information processing modules that have evolved to solve these recurrent problems that our ancestors might have faced. They particularly refer back to the Pleistocene epoch, when we were hunter-gatherers on the African savannah. So the idea is that you can kind of reverse engineer what you might think of as a problem that our ancestors might have had to have solved, and then suggest, well, this might explain why we see particular functional properties of the brain. And I'm using the term evolutionary psychology, capital E, capital P, because this is a very specific type of evolutionary psychology, but it's actually the most, in my view, still the most prominent. Tooby and Cosmides is some of the well-known instigators of this field, which kind of arose in the 1980s. But David Buss would be another example. Steven Pinker would probably classify into this type of evolutionary psychology. And it's that term is kind of being co-opted by this particular perspective, which is highly modular and relies on ideas about past selection. Okay. So another two proponents are Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, who arose sort of in a sociobiology tradition, had a background in animal behaviour, and applied these ideas to understanding human psychology. And they talked about this sex difference in willingness to take risks that are kind of explained, you might predict from a very standard view of evolutionary theory. And they've talked about this idea that there's a young male syndrome of this willing to take high risks that again might be explained by evolutionary theory, and as opposed to females being less willing to take such risks. And we looked in the literature, and there's quite a useful measure called sensation-seeking that psychologists refer to, so those interested in personality. And this is defined as the pursuit of novel or intense experiences, even if risks are involved. For example, doing snowboarding, perhaps. And actually, this is a picture of the UK female snowboarding champion. It's not a man in this picture, which probably in your head you might have thought it was the male, but this is a female champion. Social psychologists would talk about these sex differences, perhaps in terms of gender roles and sex stereotypes, and does that impact upon whether women are expected to participate in particular activities? Are children treated differently in terms of it being encouraged or discouraged from engaging in such activities? So social psychologists will be interested in this kind of responses to personality questionnaires. But if you're an evolutionary psychologist, you might predict that men and women will differ on sensation seeking as a result of these sex differences and selection pressures on our ancestors. So you can kind of see there's two ways that you could take an extreme end on this particular question. So we wanted to actually collect some data, and we were interested in whether this trait, if you ask people, do they like doing these kind of activities, whether that's changed over time, so over the past 40 years, for example. And what we did was we connected all of the data we could find on these questionnaire measures of sensation seeking. There aren't any really good measures where people actually go and watch what people do. They rely heavily on these questionnaires, asking people what they are responding. And the nice thing for this particular study was that there's this Zuckerman's sensation-seeking scale, which was produced in the 1970s, late 1970s. It hasn't changed much since then. There was a small update in 1994, but basically the same scale has been used on populations throughout that time period, which is useful for a meta-analysis because the actual measure has remained standard across this period of time. And we found 72 studies, which actually gave us over 300 effect sizes. And we just limited it to data on young adults. So most of the studies were on young adults. So very few on older individuals. Okay, so these are all people of similar ages, but the studies were conducted at different times. And for each of them, we extracted an effect size, D, which was basically the difference between males and female scores divided by the standard deviation. So for meta-analyses, what you want to do is convert all of your values to a standardized measure so that you can compare across all of your studies. And just to give you the standard effect sizes, around 0.2 is kind of small, 0.5 is medium, and greater than 0.8 is considered high as a standard estimation. So what we were asking a question, how large is this effect size and has it changed since 1978? So we're interested in the date of publication of the study, and we assumed that related to the date of when the data were collected. And to just show you some examples of what the questionnaire looked like, there's 4 subscales. So the first subscale is disinhibition, and this is a favourable attitude to uninhibited social interactions. So to give you an example, if you presented with this question, you have to choose A or B. A being heavy drinking usually ruins a good party because some people get loud and boisterous, and B, keeping the drinks full is key to a good party. Obviously, B is the correct answer for this one, but you're allowed to say which one you choose. The second subscale is boredom susceptibility. So there are some questions within the questionnaire that specifically relate to whether you dislike repetition or predictability. So an example would be, I get bored seeing the same old faces, or you like the comfort of being around people that you know. So again, you have to choose whether you're an A or a B. The third is experience seeking. So this is more of an interest in relatively low-risk novel experiences, so like trying new food or exploring a new place. So that don't necessarily involve risk, but do involve exposing yourself to stuff that you've not done before. And the fourth is thrill and adventure seeking. So most of these questions relate to physical activities, perhaps like the example here. So do you like staying at the surface of the water, or do you fancy giving scuba diving a go, or do you like skiing really fast down mountains? Does that sound fun, or would you rather ski somewhere else? So those are the four subscales. So you ask people this whole set of questions, and then you can calculate both the total answers and also the scores for these subscales as well. So I'm going to show you both things. And this is just to show you what the total sensation seeking score looks like here. So this is the effect size for all of your studies, and this is the sample size. So a positive value would mean that men are scoring higher on the whichever A's and B's are considered to be the more sensation-seeking answer. So this is a positive effect size, so males are scoring more highly. It depends on the sample size of the study, and as you'd expect, as your sample size increases, you get this nice funneling. So you can produce this funnel graph where all the data should be funneling downwards. So you'd expect a greater spread at a smaller sample size, and that's what you see. You'd also expect a proportion, 5%, to be outside of these lines by chance as well. So this shows us a nice spread of data. There doesn't seem to be any publication bias, so you're not only getting studies up at the top here. There's an expected spread of data. And the effect size here is actually 0.46, which is quite considerable. What we were interested in really, though, was across the date of publication of the study. So this is where it starts off, and this is the most recent studies, and we were quite surprised to see that this is incredibly stable. So the sex differences remain stable in terms of how people answer, how young adults answer on this questionnaire from the late 70s through to present day. So the slope of this graph is not significantly different to zero. The larger bubbles are the ones with the larger sample sizes, basically. So actually there isn't a change across all of these dates with regard to the total sensation-seeking score. If you look at the subscales, this is the disinhibition, so liking those wild social interactions. This is the boredom susceptibility. Again, males are scoring higher than females, and this doesn't change over these dates of publication. They've not changed over time. The same happened for experience seeking. That didn't change over time. The only one that did was the thrill and adventure seeking, which is actually the size of the sex difference has diminished across this study period. So when the newspapers wanted to do stories on this, they said, well, guys nowadays are really wimpy compared to their dads. That was the journal's take on the results, unfortunately. But there's various reasons why this might be the case, why this difference might have dropped. It could be a change in a male score, it could be a change in a female score, for example. And actually, rather than women scoring more highly on this subscale over time, men's scores have declined relative to females over time. So that's what's resulted in that reduced difference between the sexes. So it isn't that women are perhaps answering more willingly to engage in these kind of risky activities. The scores for men have decreased relative to that. So this decline could actually partly be due to outdated questions. That's one possibility that we thought of. So on the TAS subscale, quite a lot of the questions relate to maybe skiing or scuba diving, and perhaps nowadays snowboarding whitewater rafting, or there's some other exciting activities that the students will be much more familiar with than I am that make up adventure sports. So perhaps the questions just don't tap into what's considered risky and exciting. It could be linked to changes in social expectations or opportunities. So perhaps this is an actual difference that we're seeing in willingness to do physically risky activities, to levels of fitness change over time. So we don't have data on this, so this is all speculation of what might be underlying this difference. It could be also that people are, rather than doing these physical activities, and more interested in getting excitement through playing video games, for example. So perhaps because the questionnaires were based around actual physical activities, perhaps that means people were answering lower than they might have done if you changed the questions. So we really don't know, but there was only one of the subscales that declined over time, and the rest stayed remarkably stable. So these data could support this view that males and females differ in their average propensity to report these traits or to engage in these activities. So if you're an evolutionary psychologist, you'd look at the data and say, aha, that supports our conclusion about selection on males and females. If you're a social psychologist, you might say, oh, well, actually, during that time period, there's been a very stable set of expectations about what men and women are encouraged to do, what children are encouraged to do. So perhaps there's a stability in the socially transmitted norms or expectations or stereotypes that really haven't changed in a way that's impacted on how people report on these questionnaires over that time period. So this kind of highlights the difficulty and how easy it is to take extreme views, when actually I think it would be much more useful for researchers to take an integrated perspective on these kind of data. We're not going to get an answer just from taking one set of data and looking at extreme possible alternatives. I think what we need to do is continue to then explore all of these predictions and that might arise from these different viewpoints, and actually go and test them with data.
Gillian, is it just the difference that's remained stable, or is there like the overall amount of sensation seeking stable?
The scores were very stable. Yeah. Okay.
Question.
Yeah.
So when you showed that plot with a very flat slope, if I were to draw a line through the points, I think I might draw a nonlinear relationship.
Yeah, we checked whether non-linear were a better fit, and they weren't a better fit than the linear, so we stuck with that. Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to kind of introduce this one set of researchers who have attempted to kind of take a sensible middle line. So Alice Eagley and Wendy Wood have written a number of papers. The most recent one is 2012, which I think is a very long paper and really tries to flesh out their view of how we might think about sex differences from a perspective that isn't either one extreme or the other. So I think there's a lot of scope in their perspective, and they've referred to this as a social role theory. And they suggest that some social norms might be more likely than others to emerge and remain stable over time. Okay, so this is one thing that might be considered when we look at how social norms and expectations are present in populations. And perhaps more interestingly to me, thinking about sex differences, they suggest, well, perhaps there's a differences between males and females aren't necessarily to do with how the brains function, but are to do with other traits which show average sex differences. So average sex differences in size, height and body mass, also the fact that it's women rather than men that gestate and lactate offspring, or pregnant and breastfeed in non-animal terms. That these other differences might then make it more likely that there are certain divisions in terms of what the expectations are and gender roles than would otherwise be the case if these differences between males and females weren't there. So they say there's a lot of scope for thinking about sex differences from this starting point rather than thinking from a starting point of our environment of evolutionary adaptiveness during the Pleistocene. And I think they make a nice contribution in this regard. The evolutionary psychologists aren't interested at all. They've got a lot of stick from evolutionary psychologists, unfortunately. It's been interesting to see, but they've continued to pursue these ideas. But I would recommend that as as a set of research to look at. This just takes one diagram just to show you from their paper. So it's a much more complex sort of view of how things might be working. You know, you've got things like women's reproduction, men's size and strength, impacting on division of labour, social construction of gender, and there's other processes going on, and then you get sort of the idea of sex differences and how people behave, and you have some feedback going on as well. Okay, and I think the nice thing about this perspective is that it allows for this idea that culturally transmitted information can influence how human behaviour and cognition is constructed. Okay, so we've heard a little bit about construction approaches, and I think this kind of fits nicely within that idea. Okay, I want to just continue with this idea of using a slightly different way of showing it, and this is from the Phil Trans edition that we edited. This is just a little diagram to show you kind of what we think you should think about with populations. You have a single population here at time point 1, and this is the genotype, and this is the phenotype that you see. So you think about these two things. And at time 2, there'll be a different genotype of the population and a different set of phenotypes being shown. Okay, so here you've got genetic inheritance, and here you've got socially transmitted information. So researchers have talked about this as sort of two inheritance systems that you might want to think about, that's particularly strong for human beings given the amount of socially transmitted information that we have through culture. So if you're an evolutionary psychologist, this is how we are suggesting that evolutionary psychologists are thinking about the world. You have a very strong link here between your genes and your phenotype that's expressed. So it's this kind of jukebox idea that you've got genetically programmed modules within the brain that produce behavioural outcomes, a bit like a jukebox playing different tunes. It might depend on the environment a bit, so it's modulated by the environment, but everything is kind of related to genetic inheritance that you have. They have very little emphasis on socially transmitted information. They're happy that culture happens, that fashion spread and culture changes, that's all fine, but they think that's kind of got nothing to do with an evolutionary question, which they place firmly here in the genes, and selection on natural selection on genetic information. So fine, culture evolves, whatever, fine, but this is what we're really interested in: genes producing this phenotypes in response to particular environments. I haven't found any, sorry, this should be a capital P. I haven't found any strong evolutionary psychologists who completely dismiss this as a summary of their field. Okay, cultural evolution perspective, researchers are also interested in what the processes are here where socially transmitted information changes over time, and the use of models, including evolutionary models, to investigate how those changes can be described over time. So there's an influence of genes, but again, modulated by the environment, but this is much more to do with domain general learning processes that might bias the transmission of social information. So that's sort of a little summary of what their emphasis is, and thinking about these two inheritance systems. I just want to show you a gene culture coevolution system, which is getting closer to this integrated view of the world that I'm sort of trying to argue for. So here you've got the gene pool, and you've got behavioural phenotype. You know that culture is important, is going on. You know that genes are also there and playing a role. And actually the most significant difference here between the previous figures is this bidirectional arrow. So there's two-way interaction between the behavioural phenotype and selection at a genetic level. So the gene culture, the coevolution part, is not thinking about these systems of inheritance separately, but saying that actually we can't think about them separately. We have to think about how they interact and what these feedback loops are. Okay. I just wanted at this point again to go back to sex differences and how these different extreme interpretations are manifest in the literature. And there was an interesting study in 2014 in PNAS that got a lot of commentary that looked at sex differences in the structural connectivity within the brain. So this is a sort of top view of the brain. These are male brains on average, these are female brains. And there's a lot of connectivity within the hemispheres here, and there's a lot of connectivity between the hemispheres. And this is where there's greater interconnectivity in the reds and oranges on female compared to male data. And this is where there's greater connectivity in the male brain on average compared to the female brain. This is kind of two slightly different analyses of these data. So this is measuring adults in scanners, summarising the data and finding that on average there are differences in these connectivity. Here's just a quote from that paper. So the observations suggest that male brains are structured to facilitate connectivity between perception and coordinated action, whereas female brains are designed to facilitate communication between analytic and intuitive processing modes. And I'm always interested in the language used. So the language used here in terms of design of female brains compared to males is somewhat troubling. Okay? If you find a difference in the brain in adults, it doesn't tell you at all what the processes were by which those individuals got to this endpoint. It doesn't tell you about those developmental processes. Okay? And there's a nice book called The Gender Delusions by Cordelia Fine, which really took a go at neuroscientific data of this kind that made these large leaps of assumption from showing brains lighting up differently on average from males versus females. Again, just to show you what the wonderful science media do when they're reporting this. The Independent, the hardwired difference between male and female brains could explain why men are better at map reading. That was the Independent, great. The Guardian, male and female brains are wired differently. Scans reveal maps of neural circuitry show women's brains are suited to social skills and memory, men's to perception and coordination. And the Atlantic, male and female brains really are built differently. Astounding. Okay. So an alternative perspective to this, would be really highlighting the role of culturally transmitted information and how that influences how the brains are constructed. Okay, so we don't have to take this extreme perspective. I just wanted to point to a couple of books on developmental systems theory, which again a couple of people were mentioning yesterday. This isn't a field that I'm particularly familiar with. If people are, I'd be really interested to chat with you. But these are developmental psychologists who are really trying to attempt to take a systems approach to development and think about how an individual's prior time point impacts upon their next time point during development. And actually, I think that kind of gets directly at this idea that there's something innate. Actually, I think what people are saying is there's something in a prior time point which kind of constrains or limits or directs what happens to that system at the next time point of development. And actually what we're interested in is how those processes, which involve genetic information, epigenetic information, and social environments and cultural factors, how that impacts on how an individual develops across its lifespan. And actually it's way more complex than thinking that there's something innate and something that's learned. But actually I think this is unfortunately, the complexity is where we're going to have to go with these questions. Okay. So I'm interested in seeing how that field develops. I think they're directly addressing it. I think the cross-cultural psychologists are also addressing similar kinds of questions and similar challenges about the universality of cognition. So I think they're grappling with the same kind of questions and we're showing some sort of interesting ways of thinking about these questions that we're interested in. So I just wanted to finish with this final study. Again, it's been interesting being a zoologist going into psychology and looking at all the crazy things that psychologists do with their subjects. So one is the Ash line judgment task. So this is a very well-known psychology experiment where you go into a room as a participant and there's a line on the board, there's a line, and then there's three alternatives, and you have to say which of these lines matches in length to these. Is it A, is it B, or is it C? And you're around a table with 6 other people who are sitting there as participants. Little do you know is that they're in on the act, so that you go around the room and somebody says, oh, I think it's A, and someone else says, no, oh, I think it's B. And by the end of it, when it gets to your turn to give your answer, do you actually go with which one you think is correct, or do you go with which one other people have said is correct? Even in your head, you kind of think, oh, I'm sure it was the other one. So psychologists love kind of tricking people in all of these cruel kind of ways. But they're interested in this idea of conformity. So do you conform to what everyone else is doing, or do you stick with giving your own answer here? And there's been a meta-analysis by Bond and Smith, which have drawn all of these studies together using this methodology, and found that on average, women are more likely than men to follow a consensus view. So they're more likely to follow what the other Confederates have reported. So we were interested in this idea, and again, you could take to sort of extreme evolutionary psychology or extreme sort of experiential view of this. But interestingly, if you look at the literature, this sex difference in conformity doesn't apply across all tasks that you give people. So you can, so it's not kind of a universal feature that you find. For example, women are more likely to conform on a task if it's something to do with a male-typed behavioural task. So, for example, they ask them questions about that pertain to something to do with fishing or knitting, and you find differences in conformity based on what the content of the supposed questions are that you're asking people. So if it seems to be related to something where there's a stereotyped expectation of male better performance, then women are more likely to conform. If you give them a task where there's a greater expectation of female enhanced performance, then males are more likely to conform. Okay, so there's quite a number of studies. These are relatively old studies now, but there's some interesting studies there that show this effect of the content of the task. So this sex difference in susceptibility seems to be influenced by these ideas of expectations of the relative competence or performance of the two sexes. So we kind of wanted to pursue this idea a little bit further. So we investigated whether sex differences in conformity can be explained by this difference in confidence. So there's not a lot of talk in the sexual stereotype literature about confidence, but to me it seems a relatively plausible explanation that you have some mediating effect of confidence that might underpin this variety of results. And this might not be to do with actual accuracy. Okay. So we used two tasks. We used a very standard psychology task, which has been reported to have an expectation of greater male performance. So people kind of think that men are better than women at spatial stuff. So here you have to say, do these two objects match? Are they the same object, just rotated differently, or are they two different objects? So it's a yes-no answer. Are they the same object, just from different viewpoints, or are they different objects? Or the participants had a gender-neutral task where there isn't a sex difference in expectation of performance, and you don't actually find that males and females perform differently, which is a letter transformation task. So you take two letters here, and I'm not going to see whether you're awake enough to say whether this is correctly moved on 5 letters. So O moved on 5, does it become T? I moved on 5, does it become N? And again, it's a yes-no answer. So is that a correctly transformed letter pairing or an incorrectly transformed pairing? Does anyone think it's the correct one? Or is it incorrect? Lots of people just don't know. Too near lunchtime. Okay.
Tell us.
I'll show it again at the end. Okay. So what we did was we gave participants 23 questions, and after each question, they were asked, how confident were you in your answer on the previous question? So here's either a mental rotation question or a letter transformation. You give your answer, and then how confident on a scale of 1 to 7 were you with your answer? And then we're going to tell you what these other participants said, whether they said yes or no. And then you get the chance to change your answer if you want to. Okay? So just to show you a screenshot of this, you give your answer. It's always going to be yes, no, whichever task you're doing. How confident are you in your answer? We're going to tell you some social information, and then we're going to give you the opportunity to switch. So the outcome measures are going to be confidence, self-reported confidence, switching responses, do you switch or do you stick, and the initial accuracy of your answer. So in the mental rotation task, as you'd expect, the probability of switching increases firstly with the proportion of demonstrators disagreeing. So either they agree with you or they all disagree with you. So as you go along here, you're more likely to switch. And it also depends on your confidence in your initial answer. So if you have high confidence in your initial answer, you have a much a lowered curve, so you're much less likely to switch than if you reported a low confidence in your initial answer. So this is kind of good because this is what you'd expect to see. And I will point out that the analyses were hierarchical structural equation models that were done by Kate Cross, so hopefully don't ask me very difficult questions about the methodology of the statistics. But it allows you to do some nice things using this equation modelling approach. Just to show you in the letters transformation task, the same things happened, which was good. You get an increase in switching with the proportion of demonstrators disagreeing, and an increase with low levels of confidence. But we're really interested in, did males and females behave differently on this task, and did it depend on whether they were doing the mental rotation or the letters task? So here's the mental rotation task. So these are the female probability of switching, and this is the male probability of switching. So you have a higher probability of switching your answer on this task if you're a female compared to male. Okay. You also have lower average confidence. And the same didn't happen on the letter transformation task. So here the graphs are the same. If anything, the males are slightly higher here, and you don't get a sex difference in the willingness to switch. Okay? But what the equation modelling allows you to do is to pull this apart a little bit more and produce these kind of diagrams that look at moderating factors. So this is the mental rotation task, and we have a sex difference in confidence. So here the value is positive. Sorry, these numbers are probably a little bit small. Are positive, so males were more confident than females, and this was significantly different from 0 because those numbers don't pass 0. You have an effect of initial answer, which you would expect on confidence. There's a slight sex difference in performance on the task, as has been reported previously, and you get an effect on switching as well. So if you're low confident, you're more likely to switch. The value I haven't shown you here is actually the one we're interested in. You don't get a direct effect of sex on switching. So just because you're female doesn't mean that you end up switching more. You do get an indirect effect through these factors, through confidence. So there's a significant indirect effect of sex on switching, which is mediated by this factor confidence, which we expect it to be. And this is over and above the effects of accuracy. So women are less confident than they should be based on their performance and are more likely to switch on the basis of that lowered self-reported confidence. So females are doing something different in this task than males are. If we look at the other task, this effect goes away, so it does depend on the content of the task. So here you don't get a sex difference in confidence, you don't get a sex difference in performance, you do get that influence of initial answer, which you'd expect, and the relationship between that and confidence does impact on switching. So again, there isn't a direct effect of sex on switching here, and you don't in this task get that mediating factor of confidence. Okay, so these are the kind of approaches we're trying to investigate that are hopefully kind of taking into account some of these complexities of these interactions between these variables. Interestingly, a recent meta-analysis from 2011 looked at confidence or self-estimates of performance across a lot of different measures. So psychologists are collecting all sorts of different measures of confidence, and this is a mean effect size. So being positive, males have higher self-estimates of performance on general intelligence tasks, mathematical, logical intelligence tests, spatial intelligence tests, but not verbal intelligence tests. So this kind of question about where this sex difference in confidence arises from, again, is going to require us to take developmental systems type approach. Okay, it would be very easy to take a very strong evolutionary psychology approach to this, or a very strong social role and gender expectation approach to this. But what we would like to do is to encourage people to actually take this more complex interactionist approach to these kind of questions. So just to sort of wrap up what I'm hoping to describe here is that my view of where we're going with sex differences in human behaviour, and also more general evolutionary questions about human behaviour, really has to be moving away from this idea that genes and hormones are doing one thing, that culture and socialisation is doing another thing, and we can kind of weigh them up opposite to each other kind of acknowledge, well, there's some interaction going on between them. So there's kind of this third thing. But actually, we're still kind of sometimes framing our questions in terms of, we think these are kind of playing some role, and these are kind of also contributing, but it's really complex to say how they interact with each other. But I think that's where we have to go. Okay. So sticking evolutionary theory at the centre of this, I just wanted to finally come back to where that was. So previously I talked about this idea of standard evolutionary theory showing this, and standard evolutionary theory showing that, and how people have taken a very simplistic view when applying it to sex differences in the evolutionary psychology literature. Also, another problem that we need to grapple with is not only this complexity in this interaction, how do we start framing our questions in terms of an interaction question. So looking at that middle part of gene-environment interactions and actually throwing out the idea that there's something called genes and innate and unlearned, and that there's something called external environment and social and cultural. Kind of throwing that out and only looking at that middle part, that interaction, that constructivism. How does that fit then with this view of evolutionary theory? And actually, I think it's probably frustrating for people who are outside of evolutionary biology, who feel that they kind of know what evolutionary theory is. They kind of want to apply it to their discipline and their data. They kind of have read a bit about, evolutionary psychology, or they've read, they know a bit about what Darwin said, but they're maybe getting a lot of evolutionary theory slightly second-hand. And the challenge is to also, if you want to apply evolutionary approaches, is actually keep up to date with where evolutionary theory itself is going. Okay, and this is the challenge, and I know this is a challenge for researchers who are not from a background in evolutionary biology, who think, well, the standard evolutionary theory was there since the modern synthesis, we kind of know what it is, and we now just want to apply it. Unfortunately, the problem is evolutionary biologists are disagreeing about what evolutionary theory is. Okay, and this is actually a really exciting time for evolutionary biology. Slightly frustrating, but also quite exciting. So there has been this view. If you think about the genetic inheritance and environmental, phenotypic inheritance and socially transmitted information, the standard view of evolutionary theory is really strongly focused on natural selection on genes. Okay, and that kind of is the focus of how we have traditionally thought about evolution occurring. That natural selection on genes is kind of the most important thing that results in adaptations. Okay. What I want to point to is that actually that's being having to be rethought given everything we now know about how evolution works and how individuals develop. So you've probably heard of epigenetic inheritance as well. So you might think, well, how on earth does that then change how I'm going to have to think about evolutionary theory? So the idea is that not just genetic code is inherited, other things are inherited. Okay. And rather than spending another hour sort of giving a similar talk, I'm just going to point you to the literature where this is currently being discussed. And this is a paper from Science, so this is being discussed, in the top scientific journals. A paper from 2011 by my colleague Kevin Leyland, Kim Sterelny, who's in Australia and New Zealand, John Odling-Smee, who's a professor in Oxford, who works to promote the idea of niche construction that you might have come across. Will Hoppett, who's a very good young researcher who studies social learning, and Tobias Uller, who's an evolutionary biologist who was at Oxford. Okay, and this is a review article in Science which really puts forward this idea of having to extend the evolutionary synthesis, so going from a standard view to an extended view that really places greater emphasis on these bidirectional feedback loops between organisms and their environment, which kind of fits with this sort of developmental systems approach of thinking about how organisms develop. Okay, so there are feedbacks continually through development between genetic information, between cellular processes, between physiological systems, with maternal effects, interactions with the social environment, including socially transmitted information. And this complex view of development, which involves these feedback interactions, is being dragged into centre stage of evolutionary theory. And whereas Mayer really made this proximate ultimate distinction, where proximate is to do with kind of the physiological mechanisms and development and all that kind of stuff, whereas ultimate is really where the evolutionary stuff's going on, these functional questions and questions about evolutionary history. What this new approach is doing is actually saying you can't just resign development to approximate question. You need to incorporate development into your evolutionary framework, or you're actually really missing half of what's going on. You're really focusing on genetic selection and ignoring all of these feedback loops which influence and direct the process of evolution itself. Okay, so that article makes this point. It's been cited over 150 times already since 2001. There are critics within evolutionary biology, so this is why it's quite exciting. Not all evolutionary biologists agree that we need to sort of rethink and actually more fully incorporate these feedback interactions. Some are sticking with the view that actually a standard theory where you're focusing on a gene-centric view of evolutionary theory has worked so far and it's fine and we should just stick with it. We've kind of been talking about feedback stuff, but it's already there. Whereas these researchers are saying, actually, we've ignored it too much. We've ignored the active role of development and the active role of the organism as part of the evolutionary process. We've kind of only focused on one end of evolutionary processes, and actually we need a much more complex view because that will provide us with a better understanding of how evolution actually progresses. To point you to another shorter paper, which was out at the end of last year, sorry, it should be 2014 this came out, where Leyland and colleagues, slightly different set of researchers, but including Ulla and Odeling Smee, for example, are suggesting, yes, we need to actually rethink how we think evolutionary theory works and what it shows us and what the roles of these feedback loops are. And this isn't a minor thing. This does actually substantially impact on how we should be thinking about evolutionary theory. We have some very well-known researchers, Hobie Kerstra, for example, who are arguing, saying, no, the standard theory that we've used has been fine so far, and actually we don't need to modify it greatly. I'm on this camp, but a lot of people are still here. I would predict over time that this camp gives us a much more complex and full understanding of how these, for example, epigenetic processes might need to be incorporated in how we think of evolutionary theory. So the unfortunate thing for people outside of this field is that these very important debates are still ongoing, and I think we need to kind of keep an eye on these and make sure when we're thinking about evolutionary theory, are we thinking about the full scope of evolutionary theory, or are we kind of relying on what we think we know about evolutionary theory, which is probably very much of a standard modern synthesis approach. So this approach really does fit more with this idea of development is highly important. The human brain and mind is constructed over a lifespan, and we should be thinking about those interactive processes. And I'm going to finish there and just thank the colleagues who worked on the experimental work with me. And thank you for your attention.